Diabetes Connections is brought to you by One Touch. Every touch is a step forward. By Dexcom. Take control of your diabetes and live life to the fullest with Dexcom. By Tandem Diabetes Care, makers of the t:slim X2 insulin pump. And by Real Good Foods. Real food you feel good about eating.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, getting back to basics. We're starting a new monthly series taking a look at the essentials of diabetes. This week, insulin.
So if you give insulin a 15-minute head start, then it's starting to work as you're starting to eat so that you better match the insulin's peak action when your blood sugar is actually going up. And it's very effective.
Endocrinologist Bryce Nelson takes us through what it does, how it works, and the differences among brands. He's also our community connection this week, a family connection to type 1, really guided his life. I can't wait for you to hear this story. Plus, tell me something good. A middle schooler comes up with a design to help her grandfather get all the insulin, every drop, out of his pens. We'll tell you about the prize-winning You Get It All device. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of Diabetes Connections. I'm your host, Stacey Sims. And as we are getting ready to say goodbye to January, quick heads up, we are heading into Diabetes Podcast Week very soon. That is the second full week of February, and I'll be posting more on social media and talking about it in the next couple of episodes. But Diabetes Podcast Week is something I put together a few years ago based on Diabetes Blog Week, which has been around for a very long time. And I thought, there are a lot of different podcasts. We're still trying to get people to learn how to listen to them. And we're all different, right? There's a podcast for every person with diabetes, whether you're a parent or an adult. You have type 2, you have type 1, you have gestational. There's really something for everybody. So why not get everybody together and do something good? So once again, D-Podcast Week is going to benefit the Spare a Rose campaign. And that, of course, is every year right around Valentine's Day to benefit kids around the world who live with type 1 and do not have life-saving insulin and supplies. So much more to come on that. I'll start putting the links in the show notes this week. I'm really excited. We have 12 shows this year. For the first time, we have a Spanish language show. We have dads jumping on in with a new podcast. Good stuff to come. So definitely stay tuned. We are also buzzing around here about Chris Rudin being on the Titan Games for NBC last week. I don't know about you, but I've been watching every episode, waiting for Chris to show up. It is so exciting. Now, if you've seen the episode, and spoiler alert here, you know it wasn't the outcome he was hoping for, but man, did he make the most of his time in the national spotlight with just a terrific message. The Rock tweeted out the video of it the following day. So if you haven't seen it, I will put some links in the show notes, but congratulations to Chris. Just getting there is an amazing accomplishment, and I highly doubt this is the last a national audience will see of him. If you want to hear my most recent interview with Chris, we just did it a couple of weeks ago to start the new year. I'll link that up in this episode as well. And we talked to him before he got really famous and hung around with The Rock. We talked to Chris almost 2 years ago now. And if you haven't heard that interview, it's well worth revisiting. People change over time, and he goes much more in depth on his diagnosis story and some other issues. But man, what a great representative of our community. Way to go, Chris. All right, as I said, something new this week. I see a lot of basic questions on Facebook and in my email, and I thought maybe we could do a little bit here to help. So each month, we're going to do a deep dive on a different topic. This month is insulin. Upcoming issues include what are ketones, all about glucagon, how an insulin pump actually works. I know many of you are well-versed in these issues, but I'm 12 years in, and I learned a lot from talking to Dr. Nelson this week. So here's what we're going to do. This episode is going to be the regular show. You're only really going to hear about a third of the interview I did with Dr. Nelson all about insulin. In a few days, I'm going to put a bonus episode with the entire talk because it is a real deep dive. It's actually more than an hour, and we go through all the different kinds of insulin, long-acting, short-acting, Afrezza, Walmart insulin. I'm actually going to work on ways to get you the info from this episode and maybe some other extras in a readable form Diabetes Connections extras. So stay tuned for that. And just one more note before we jump in here. This interview is not about the price of insulin. Of course, that is an issue. And Dr. Bryce does talk about coverage and insurance companies a bit, but this is not an interview or debate about the price of insulin, which is something we have covered and will continue, of course, to do on this show. All right. Diabetes Connections is brought to you by OneTouch. Handwriting your blood glucose levels is the ultimate throwback. The OneTouch Vario Flex Meter seamlessly syncs with the free OneTouch Reveal mobile app to create your dynamic electronic logbook. And when you choose the OneTouch Reveal mobile app, you'll be joining thousands of other people living with diabetes. In fact, OneTouch Reveal was the #1 downloaded diabetes management app in the US, Canada, France, and the UK. To upgrade today to the OneTouch Vario Flex Meter and OneTouch Reveal mobile app, visit diabetes-connections.com and click on the OneTouch logo. My guest this week is definitely one of the good guys, and you'll know it as soon as you hear him. Dr. Bryce Nelson is a pediatric endocrinologist, most recently based in South Carolina, but he is leaving. He is heading up to a new position in Virginia. Sad day around the Carolinas, as Dr. Nelson is not only a doctor who obviously cares about his patients and their families, but he also started a diabetes camp for them. Before he hit the road, I was able to talk to him for our first Diabetes Connections Extra segment. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm so excited to start these, educational segments and see what we can really learn. So thanks for making some time. I know you're very busy.
Well, thank you. This is quite an honor. I appreciate it, Stacey, that you've allowed me to be your first endocrinologist you're talking to in this series.
Well, sometimes that's good. Sometimes you're the guinea pig. So I'll ask you again at the end. We'll see how it goes.
Well, yeah, as a researcher, that's okay.
Before we get started talking about the basics of insulin, let me just kind of let my listeners get to know you a little bit more. You're a pediatric endocrinologist. We met several years ago at a conference. You really seem to go above and beyond for the families in your practice. Tell me a little bit about the camp you started. This is just a couple of years ago, right?
Right. So, we started Camp Buddy about 3 years ago. It was in response to a need. We didn't have a day camp for young children. So this is a camp that for children ages 6 to 12 that they can come to for the day, and really just gives them a chance to be around that experience that they have at schools or elsewhere. Sometimes kids can feel outside of the quote-unquote community, and here our camp is really a celebration of the community. So the kids get to come together and learn that they can be a kid with diabetes. And that's an important theme of everything that I do in my practice and how I work with these children, is that they're not diabetics. That is a word that I really, really don't like. They are children who happen to have diabetes. They're not defined by this disease, and we want them to start learning at an early age that they can still do all of the things that children can do and be children, but learn how to manage their diabetes through those things. And I think that the earlier we start to do that, where it just becomes second nature and it's just part of how they live with the condition, then the better off these children are long term. And that is something that I maintain throughout all of my practice, and something that all ages I try to really, really push that theme, because I think that's what leads to success in life with this, is learning how to live with this and learning you can still make your dreams. You can still set all your dreams. You can still set all your goals and achieve all of those. Just have to learn how to manage your condition, and then the world is your oyster. You see a lot of patients who are tiny, who are 6 or even under. I know you see toddlers as well as a pediatric endocrinologist. Right. But you see, the newly diagnosed. And I think a lot of what we'll talk about today is for people who are newer diagnosed, adults and kids, sure, or who just, I'll be honest with you, I have a great endocrinologist and a great CDE, and I still feel like I'm learning all the time. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to get into this basic info. So let's just dial down and get really basic, Bryce. My first question about insulin. Yeah, let's do it. My first question about insulin is, why do people with type 1 diabetes need insulin? Yeah, so the reason that people with type 1 diabetes need insulin is really based on the disease process itself. So we know that type 1 diabetes is what we call an autoimmune disease. So we all have immune systems that our immune system is built to protect us from things outside of us. So things that could potentially harm us. So the most common thing that we think about with that is infectious disease. So bacteria, viruses, those kind of things. The immune system is exquisitely designed to be able to help you with that. But because it is so well designed, there can sometimes be hiccups in the system. So it's like children can act up from time to time, right? So it's the immune system is acting up. It's not supposed to attack us. So our immune system is supposed to attack things that don't belong to us. But in the case of type 1 diabetes, the immune system got tricked. And, Stacey, we still are just now understanding what are some of those triggers for that autoimmune process or that process by which the body starts to develop diabetes. So that's a process that starts before people develop symptoms of diabetes, which we'll talk about in just a second. That autoimmune process gets triggered, and so the immune system starts to attack the part of the body that makes insulin. And that part of the body is called the pancreas. So the pancreas does several different things for the body, but in this case, what we're talking about is it makes a very important hormone called insulin. Insulin is the hormone that our body uses to lower blood sugar. So as we all eat, that food is being broken down in our digestive system into different things. And one of the things that's being broken down into is a sugar called glucose. And our body uses glucose for energy. The muscles use it to move, to walk, to do all the things that we do. And we store excess energy in fat. Insulin is the hormone that tells the body to put the glucose where it's supposed to be, into the muscle, into fat. So it's that trigger. It's what's keeping our blood sugars, in addition to other hormones, in check and where it's supposed to be. So people who have type 1 diabetes, when that initial autoimmune process gets started, it's been killing off the cells of the pancreas that make insulin. And that's a process that takes time. It doesn't happen right away. So that's why people can have that happen and never have any symptoms initially. So it's not till their body reaches a certain level of those cells that make insulin. Once they've been destroyed to a certain level, the body can't compensate anymore. It can't keep up. And as that happens, the insulin levels drop and blood sugars start to go up because there's not the hormone there to tell the body to put that sugar where it needs to be. And as those blood sugars go up, that's why people develop the symptoms. That's why people get thirsty, because the body's recognizing there's too much sugar. The body is also trying to get rid of that sugar in any way it can, so people start urinating more frequently. It's because the kidney is trying to get rid of that extra sugar, okay? And because you're urinating more frequently, that's making you more thirsty. And because the sugar is not going into the skeletal muscle, into fat, then the body thinks that you're not getting energy. So that starts to make people hungry. So that's why you get the classic signs of people who have diabetes are increased thirst, increased urination, and increased hunger are the classic three.
I always thought the hunger was tied to the thirst, but that's because your muscles need that?
Yeah, it's because you're not getting energy. Your body thinks you're starving. And that's also why people start losing weight initially. It's one of the reasons they're losing weight initially is because your insulin is a storage hormone, so it tells fat to store energy for a rainy day. So in the absence of insulin, if those cells that make insulin are gone, then you don't have that signal anymore. So your body, because it thinks it's starving, it's tapping into its stores in fat.
Let's talk about the different types of insulin now that we know what it does. And I don't want to talk about brand names necessarily yet, but, regular, long-acting. Can you take us through?
Sure.
Then let's start with the older versions, which are still around.
What we do and why we treat with insulin is really a tenet of, or it is something that we all do in endocrinology, is hormone replacement. So the medicines that we use, the insulin that we use, is trying to replace what is not there. Because as type 1 diabetes, it's a insulin deficient state. And so we started out with, and this, started back in the 1920s, obviously, with Banting and Best. They were able to isolate and find the hormone insulin, and Lilly was able to scale that up, market it as regular human insulin. But we can only give insulin as an injection. So we can never give insulin as a pill for it to work because we have to bypass the digestive system because insulin is what we call a peptide. And so your stomach is very adept. It's very good at breaking down peptides. So if you try to give insulin as a pill, your stomach just breaks it down and deactivates it. And so it doesn't work. So we can never really provide insulin right now in a form that our body can use it. Now, who's to say what's going to happen down the road? I'm sure some very smart person will figure out how to do that. But we don't have that capability right now. So that's why insulin can only be given as an injection. So any of the insulins that we use have to be given as an injection underneath the skin. And most of us now, in the standard of care is we practice using two main different types of insulin.
Right back to Dr. Nelson explaining what he means there. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. And do you know about Dexcom Clarity? It is their diabetes management software. And for a long time, I thought it was something just our endo used. But you can use it both on your desktop or as an app on your phone. And it's a really easy way to keep track of the big picture. I now check it about once a week. It really helps Benny, and it helps me dial back and see longer-term trends, and it helps us not overreact to just what happened one day or even just 1 hour. The overlay reports help put context to Benny's glucose levels and patterns, and of course you share the reports with your care team, which makes appointments a lot more productive. Managing diabetes is not easy, but I feel like we have one of the best CGM systems working for us. Find out more at diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. Now back to Bryce Nelson talking about the two very general different types of insulin.
The concept we use is what we call basal/bolus insulin. And this is really derived from us trying to be physiologic. So the way that we give insulin is so that we can, quote unquote, think like a pancreas. Now, I am quoting that from Gary Shiner. I don't know if I can do that on your show, but
Gary's a pal. Okay. That's a book. If you're not, as you listen, the book is called Think Like a Pancreas. Gary Shiner is more than happy to sign a copy probably and send it to you. But I will actually link it up with I know I'm terrible, but I'll link it up with this episode because it's a terrific book. And no, he would certainly not be upset at you mentioning it.
Yeah, no, that's the way that we try to really teach this and what basal bolus is intended for, because the way that our body makes insulin is it puts a little bit of insulin in our bloodstream all the time, okay? And it does all the background work of insulin. So it's what's keeping the ketones in the right range that they should be. It's what's telling the liver to deal with sugar as it should. It's what's telling muscle to deal with sugar as it should. And then when we all eat, our digestive system recognizes that big shot of sugar that we just got, and it secretes insulin in response to that. And so you get what we call a bolus of insulin secretion from the body in response to a meal that has sugar in it. And so we try to mimic that in the clinical setting by giving injections of insulin. And in order for us to do that, we have to use two different types. Now, in the past, we've had several different ways that we had done this. Initially, it was just with regular insulin, which starts to work in about an hour. It peaks after 4 to 6 hours and is gone in about 6 to 8 hours. Not many of us use that as a go-to for how we treat patients anymore because that led to a lot of problems with how it doesn't really match how people eat. It doesn't match people's daily lives. So it led to a lot of blood sugar variability. It led to a lot of low blood sugars, high blood sugars, and it didn't lead us to good control of the blood sugars. And so very smart people figured out that, well, one type of insulin is not going to be enough, that we just can't manage this and think like the pancreas because it's not how the pancreas thinks with this. So they developed other, what we call basal insulins. So these are insulins that do that background work that I was describing before. So these just work in the background. They don't change blood sugar very much, but they do a lot of background work. And so that one of the main ones that was used at the time several years ago was MPH. And that was an insulin that started to work in about 4 to 6 hours and was gone by about 8 to 12 hours. So you had to give that insulin twice a day. And so initially people were doing a combination of the regular insulin and MPH, doing 2 daily injections. And with that, they had a lot of variability with their blood sugars from day to day and also between different people. People absorb those insulins a little bit differently. And so then some very smart people figured out, well, we can adjust the insulin molecule a little bit and make it more rapid acting and actually make it sustain longer into the bloodstream. If we mix it with certain chemicals, it will stay in the bloodstream for longer. So that's where we've gotten to in our current treatment, is where we have basal insulins that do the background work and that typically last about 24 to 36 hours. So they're doing a lot of the background work. And then when we all eat, or if we have a high blood sugar, we use a rapid-acting insulin that typically starts to work anywhere from about 12 to 15 minutes. It peaks in about an hour and then is gone within 3 or 4 hours. So it makes it ideal for helping control rise in blood sugar after a meal, or if the blood sugar is high, to help bring it down.
And you've mentioned what I was going to ask about, which are onset, peak time, and duration, because all these insulins have different timing, situations where, so when clinicians talk about those things, like onset would be when it starts working, peak time is what it says, right, when it's strongest, and then duration. Now, as a layperson who's been dealing with diabetes for more than a decade, it seems to me that peak time and duration is different person to person, even with the same insulin. Is that true?
Absolutely, it's true. I mean, I see that clinically all the time, because there are so many things that can affect how that the body is dealing with that insulin that you're giving as an injection. So it could depend on the different body site that you're injecting it at. It could depend on whether or not you have been injecting in the same site and have developed scar tissue so that you're not absorbing that insulin as well. And also I see some people who develop what we call insulin resistance. So the insulin doesn't work quite as well and as strongly in certain individuals, or it might peak at a different time. And so clinically, and after you see thousands of patients, you see that. You see that people have different responses. And we know that through studies too. And it's something I point out to my patients is that people report these onset, peak time, duration. You have to remember that those are the averages and standard deviations based on a research study. So that means that 95% of people will have a rapid acting insulin that will start to work in about 15 minutes, will peak in about an hour, and be gone in 3 to 4 hours. But 5% of people won't do that. Theirs might be earlier onset. Theirs might be a little bit later onset in terms of when it starts to work. That's why one of the statements in the American Diabetes Association recommendations for clinical care is that care should be individualized, because not everybody is going to react that same way.
No doubt. And as you listen to, if you use the insulin pump or plan to, it's good to ask your educator or whoever helps you set it up that things like duration are actually variables within the pump. So you can tell the pump how long you think the insulin will last. That's that insulin on board, right, Bryce? I don't want to say anything out of turn here, but we have changed that over the years. It seems like insulin used to last longer when Benny was teeny tiny, and you're able to adjust that in almost every insulin pump. Yeah,
and so some of that is, I mean, that's glad that you're recognizing that, because that is absolutely true, Stacey. It can vary over time, especially, when puberty hits. Wow, I'm sure you saw that.
Oh, my goodness.
Puberty can be a booger bear.
I have to interrupt because you gave me the funniest advice. I think when we met, Benny was maybe 10 or 11, and we were talking about what was already starting to go on. And in addition to the physical changes, and I've shared this on the show, and Benny knows and is mortified, but he knows I talk about it. It's the mental stuff, too. And I think you said something like that's the head in the bucket phase.
Yep,
right?
That's the head in the bucket. That's a quote from my father, head in the bucket.
Let's go through the brands of insulin, if we could.
Sure.
Okay, so let's start with Novolog. We'll start with the faster-acting insulins. Novolog and Humalog have similar durations and peaks and that sort of thing?
They do. So Novolog and Humalog are similar in their reported onset, peak duration, and or peak onset and duration of activity. They're pretty similar. We use them interchangeably in practice, and there's really not much difference from patient to patient and within patients from day to day in terms of how those insulins work. Now, the thing to point out in what you learn in clinical care when you see a lot of patients is that there can be some variability. So I have some patients that prefer particular brands, and they swear that they see differences when they are on different brands. And I support that, because the patient is living with it every day and they're seeing those things, and you need to listen when they're telling you those things. But the other thing is that if they're perceiving or they feel like they're having success with that, we need to support that and continue to individualize that care. But when you look at the research studies, there's really not that much difference in terms of how those two insulins act.
We see that question very often in lots of parent Facebook groups and adult type 1 Facebook groups. My insurance wants to switch me from Novolog to Humalog or vice versa. Am I okay? And I think you've answered that in that you should be, but definitely talk to your endo because just in case.
Right.
Okay, the next insulin is another quicker onset, fast-acting, Apidra. What's different about Apidra as compared to Novolog and Humalog?
Yeah, so Apidra, it's just another, they changed the insulin molecule in a little bit of a different way than Novolog and Humalog. All three of those have a little bit of change in the insulin molecule that makes it more rapid acting. And the change they made in the Apidra made its onset of action a little bit faster. So supposedly it starts to work at about 10 to 12 minutes as opposed to 15 minutes. So it's a little bit earlier onset of action. Me personally, in clinical practice, I haven't seen that much difference between Apidra, Novolog, and Humalog. So clinically, because most people don't really notice the blood sugars coming down a lot for about an hour after they eat. And so they all have pretty similar peak onsets. Now, there are some people that Apidra does work better for them. So if I'm having problems and say they're more of a insulin resistant person, or I'm having a problem where they're rising pretty fast after a meal with their blood sugar, I'll try Apidra to see if I can get a little bit better control for them. But it's another one that I don't see that much difference clinically in terms of how it's helping me. I certainly haven't seen changes in A1C, switching people from Novolog to Humalog and to Apidra.
Apidra, too, is a little bit different in some insulin pumps. We use the Tandem, and I believe it's not indicated for that. Is there something with the makeup? It doesn't work well in an insulin pump?
That's correct. And part of that is they're not approved to use it in that pump.
Okay, and then the other really new insulin is Fiasp. What is that? What makes that different? Is it really much more fast acting?
It's similar to Apidra. So its onset of action is pretty similar to Apidra's. So clinically, it behaves similarly to Apidra. So I have not found it personally to make that much of a difference. You can edit this out if you want to, Stacey, but in South Carolina, that's not one of the preferred. So I don't get much opportunity to use that insulin, so I don't have that much clinical experience with that one yet. But the data is that it's not that much different than Apidra.
Okay. We'll have to wait and see. But it works the same. If you were on Humalog or Novolog, you could talk to your endocrinologist about Apidra or Fiasp. Let's switch over to some of the longer-acting insulins. When Benny was diagnosed, we were started on Lantus. Can you explain the differences between, I guess it's Lantus and Levemir right now?
Yeah. Well, so there's been really an explosion of new basal insulins over the last couple of years. The one that was really kind of revolutionized the basal bolus and how we treat diabetes was Lantus, or insulin glargine is the generic name of it. And it's insulin that they have mixed with a certain chemical that will permit the body to slowly release it from the tissue underneath the skin. So it was the first insulin that we really had that lasted a full, in most people, about 24 hours. And it was relatively what we call peakless, meaning that it didn't really rise much in the bloodstream. And so you saw that clinically most of the time. But when you really look at how that insulin works, it does. You get a peak at about 3 hours. It's a smaller peak compared to the rapid-acting insulin, so it doesn't drop blood sugars that much. It's just doing background work. But some people had that peak. So like in very young children, less than 3, that particular insulin I would give in the morning because I would want them to have that 3-hour peak during the day, not at night. And then after 3, and that's not based on any data, Stacey, that's just personal practice. But that's why in younger kids, I would tend to give that insulin first thing in the morning as opposed to giving it at bedtime.
I know a lot of people who split up their dose of long-acting. They'll do half of it in the morning, half of it in the evening. Does that make sense?
Yeah, with Lantus, that really is more of what we call a dose effect. So once you get to about more than 40 units of Lantus a day, it really works a little bit better to split it up. And the reason is because the higher the dose of Lantus, the more that peak is at 3 hours, and the more the risk of hypoglycemia starts to creep in. And so you minimize that risk of low blood sugar by splitting the dose. And some people feel like they get better steady control. Now, another insulin, Levemir, it's also a basal insulin. It lasts about 24 hours. It tends to be a little bit more variable, and so more people require that insulin twice a day as opposed to once a day. But again, it's designed to last about 24 hours. And so some of that is just trying to figure out how, whether you need that Levemir once or twice a day. So an advantage of Lantus is that it's more consistently lasts 24 hours. But a disadvantage to Lantus is that it burns when you give it. So it's one of the few insulins that we have that you actually feel when we give it. And in children, that can be a big thing. that could be a barrier to care for some kids. So there are some that if they're really having a problem with the burning with Lantus, will switch to Levemir. And for a while, those were really the two main basal insulins that we had on the market. And most of us were using Lantus as our main basal insulin. Now, I guess about 2 years ago, I'm on the market called Tresiba, which is insulin degludec is another name for it. And that's actually approved for children down to age 2. And it's an insulin that lasts for 36 hours. What you can do, because it lasts 36 hours, is it actually develops what we call a steady state. So you get a much more flat insulin release from the tissue underneath the skin. And so it is in some ways a little bit better basal insulin that you use. Some advantages we have in kids is that there's actually information that there's less low blood sugar overnight with Tresiba because there's less of that peak. You have less peak in effect. It's just doing the background work. And in practice, I've been switching several patients over to Tresiba. I've liked it as a basal insulin.
I'll be honest with you. When I describe Tresiba, because Benny has used it, I feel like I'm talking about whiskey. I say, oh, there's no burn. It's smooth. It's funny when you think about it like that.
It's great.
It is a really interesting difference. My question for you is, you mentioned it's got a 36-hour, I've heard even a little bit longer duration, but you give it every 24 hours, but it doesn't tank you. How does that work? Is it that steady state you were talking about?
It's steady state. So it's the same principle that we use for oral medications. So we, in general, oral medications take you about 4 times to take it for your body to reach what we call steady state. And so where it's in a consistent level in the bloodstream. With Lantus, you don't get that. So when you look at Lantus, it never really develops a steady state because it starts to come up at about 3 hours. And then by about 18 hours, the levels of Lantus in the bloodstream start to fall. And it's usually gone by about 24 hours. So between 18 to 24 hours, people can see some differences in their blood sugars on Lantus. And then you give the injection and you get that 3-hour peak and you start to come back. With Tresiba, it doesn't stack. Because you have that 36-hour, you have a little bit of overlap, and so it develops what we call a steady state. So a lot of the advantages with the Tresiba, so it doesn't stack, as some people might understand that term. So it doesn't cause low blood sugars by giving the doses. It also gives you a little bit better variability with when you can dose it. So like in children, this is what I see a lot because I'm a pediatric endocrinologist, using the concept, quote-unquote, bedtime. Bedtime varies a lot for kids, especially for our teenagers, right, Stacey?
Oh, yeah.
And wait till you get to the summertime. So bedtime might be 3 a.m. Bedtime might be 10 p.m. And Lantus, you really have to give within about an hour of the same time every night to maintain a better basal state. Tresiba, because it has that tail that goes 36 hours, you can give it at true bedtime. So, as long as they take it before bed, you don't really see much difference in terms of how it acts. And so that gives people a lot of better flexibility for how they're dosing, which is an advantage because that's what life is, right? Life is flexible. Life is messy. Life is variable. And so if we have an insulin that can better work in that situation, we've got a better chance for patients because people want to be able to live their lives. They want to be able to go to their son's football game or their daughter's baseball game or softball game, and so that tends to lend itself a little bit better to that. And it's part of the reason I've really liked it as a go-to basal insulin.
Before we move on, when we talked about Lantus, did you say it's also, is it Basaglar? Is that a brand name?
Yes, Basaglar is a brand name. It is what we call a quote-unquote bioequivalent. So it is the same molecule as Lantus. It was just made by a different company, so it's a quote-unquote generic Lantus.
Got it.
Is how people can kind of think of it. It's the same molecule. It works the same as Lantus. Because it's a bioequivalent, the FDA doesn't require bioequivalents to go through quite the same rigorous study as Sanofi had to go through with Lantus. But it's insulin glargine. It's the same thing. So
if your insurance company puts you on Basaglar, it's the same thing as Lantus, as we've discussed.
It's the same thing. Okay. Correct. And I haven't seen much difference switching people over. There can always be exceptions. That's why you need to talk to your endocrinologist or your provider if you're noticing problems. But I haven't seen any real problems if insurance companies are switching over. Because it's a quote-unquote generic, it's cheaper.
Let's talk about the so-called Walmart insulin. This is different from what we've discussed. Is that the NPH? Is that the?
So it's NPH and regular is what they mostly prescribe. So those are cheaper. And so for some people without insurance, unfortunately, those are the ones that we sometimes have to use. I don't face that situation much in children because children are typically, if they're not covered under private insurance, they're usually covered by Medicaid. And so I don't have that problem that often. It's not till children become young adults and emerging adults and around 18 and 19 and are aging out of Medicaid and they don't have insurance yet that we have to consider using some of those. But I rarely do that. But it still can be effective. But it's an older way that we use insulin. So you have to either mix those insulins together, and it's going back to doing 2 injections a day.
So definitely talk to your endocrinologist or an educator if you do need to do that, because let's face it, unfortunately, people may have to. And if you find yourself as you're listening in that situation, it's not interchangeable with these newer insulins. No. So please make sure to find out how to use it if you need to.
Yeah, and you can't mix those with the newer insulins. So those older insulins, NPH and regular, you can mix those together. But with the newer insulins, you can't mix them together. You can't mix them with those. And if you do have to switch over to that, I agree with you on that, Stacey. You need to let your endocrinologist provider know because they'll have to look at your total daily doses of insulin that you're currently taking and figure out your new doses and work with you on that to get to the right dose. On those insulins, you tend to have to be a little bit more strict with your diet in terms of the timing of when you eat and what you eat. And it can work quite well if you're pretty consistent and regimented with how you eat and making sure you get those insulins at specific times. It can still work well because it's the hormone, it's insulin. It's going to bring your blood sugar down.
These are all injectable insulins, and we're not going to go through the differences between syringes and pens and pumps. Maybe we'll do that down the line in another episode. But there is an insulin that's on the market. I know it's not pediatric, which is your specialty, but let's at least touch on Afrezza, the inhaled insulin.
Yeah, so the concept of inhaled insulin has been around for a while. Part of that is people, don't like to take injections. And so looking at alternative ways that we can provide insulin. And as I mentioned, we have some barriers that we can't get by the digestive system at this point to take it as a pill. So some very smart people at Mankind developed this molecule. And it's actually human insulin. So it's like regular insulin. But they were able to develop a particle delivery system and take advantage of lung delivery. One of the advantages of lung delivery, so this is an inhaled insulin, so this is something that you inhale like you would an inhaler for asthma treatment, something like that, for people to kind of conceptualize how you would take this. The lung, it has a lot of what we call surface area, so things can get into your bloodstream pretty quickly. Obviously, we want oxygen to get into our bloodstream very quickly, and we want carbon dioxide to get out very quickly. And so the lung is specifically designed to do that. And so they took advantage of that, saying, well, why don't we try to inhale insulin to get into the bloodstream faster to see if it works faster and to see if it mimics the way the insulin normally works. Because even our rapid-acting insulins, while they're great, they can peak in about 15 minutes. That's a lot slower than the way human insulin works. When the pancreas is working, it can put insulin, it can vary that peak, minute to minute. And so that's hard for us to mimic. Even though we try to think like the pancreas, we still haven't been able to do that yet from a medical standpoint. But this Afrezza gives us a way to possibly do that. And the other thing, it's not an injection. That's the other advantage is that's still a barrier to a lot of people is having to give insulin as an injection.
Yeah, the people who use Afrezza, as you say, on social media are quite passionate about it, and we've done entire shows about it. And I think it's really exciting and interesting stuff. Yeah. So thanks for touching on that. Yeah. One more concept before we start wrapping things up here. I do want to make sure to talk about pre-bolusing and why that is effective. We've mentioned the onset of insulin. It's slower than food, right? So, generally speaking, it's a good idea to bolus before a meal. Can you talk about that?
Yes, and that's the main reason, Stacey, is that we can't be the pancreas. We can only think like the pancreas. We have to wait about 15 minutes on average for those bolus insulins to start working. And some of our more higher carb meals, so the higher the carb meal, the quicker your blood sugar starts to rise in your bloodstream. So it becomes a mismatch. And that's also why liquid sugar beverages really are not a great part of a regular diet. They're not a great part of the regular diet anyway. But for people with diabetes, it's particularly problematic because those will make your blood sugar go up within a matter of a couple of minutes. But we got to wait 15 minutes before insulin starts to work. We see this a lot at breakfast. I'm sure you've seen this with Benny. I mean, and it doesn't matter how much whole grain he eats first thing in the morning, it still tends to rise. I mean, that could also be some hormone things as well. But our breakfasts in the United States tend to be pretty carb heavy in the morning. And so you get that rise. Breakfast cereal is notorious for this, where you'll have that blood sugar start to rise. And not even that it's peaking, it's just it's starting to go up. And you're having to wait for the insulin to work. And then when you mismatch those, you have problems down the road later on in the day. And so pre-bolusing is an attempt to try to mitigate some of that or try to prevent some of that. So if you give insulin a 15-minute head start, then it's starting to work as you're starting to eat so that you better match the insulin's peak action with when your blood sugar is actually going up. And it's very effective, but it's also very intense. So that's always not the easiest thing for a teenager that wants to sleep in till the very last minute and roll up out of bed and just roll out of school and is eating a Nutri-Grain bar on the bus or in the car. It doesn't always lend itself easily to life. We certainly try to encourage that as much as we can because it does tend to it thinks like the pancreas better that way.
Bryce, thank you so much for joining me, for talking about insulin and so much more today. I really appreciate your time. This is extremely helpful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Stacey. This has been quite an honor, and I am so thankful that we have you in the fight and have you as an advocate. And you're such a strong voice in your shows, and your presence is omnipresent. And I'm happy to have you as an ally and an advocate.
Wow, thank you.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
Okay, as I said, that interview was edited down, and the full interview is a little bit more than an hour. So I'm going to release that as a bonus episode later this week. Tons of great info. I really do think, especially for newer diagnosed people, it is something to go through and listen to carefully. It is a bit much for the regular show here, especially as many of you may be familiar with it. This way you can pick and choose. I do want you to hear a little bit more of Dr. Nelson, though. So his family connection to diabetes is our community connection this week. Community Connection brought to you by Tandem Diabetes, makers of the t:slim X2 insulin pump. Now, this is a bittersweet story, I will say. Dr. Nelson's uncle lived with type 1 diabetes. He was an inspiration, and as you'll hear as he tells the story, he was even Dr. Nelson's very first patient. You decided to become an endocrinologist for a reason that I think is worth talking about. Would you mind sharing that story? I know it may be difficult, but your uncle lived with type 1, and he was diagnosed a long time ago when care wasn't what it is today, right?
My uncle, Mitchell Dryman, he was diagnosed when he was 12, and this was back in the early 60s. And as you know, Stacey, it was a much different time. The continuous glucose monitoring and insulin pumps in regular use just were really a myth. They were science fiction at the time. We just didn't really have access to that. And my grandparents did the absolute best they could. He took regular insulin, which I know we'll talk about in a little bit, and he didn't have glucometers. So, yeah, it was a much different time, and he did the best he could. My grandparents did the best they could with what they had. And he really is who really showed me that you can live life with diabetes, but you fight it, because he didn't let diabetes stop him. He was always really the life of everybody that he was around. He was the light. When Mitchell walked in the room, the place just came alive. And, I remembered coming home to visit with family at Christmas, and he was the one I was looking forward to get to meet, because he always just loved hanging out with us and hanging around with the kids and making us feel special. And that really started our friendship and his mentorship to me. And even if he didn't know that, he didn't know that he was showing me those things. And when I was a kid, I didn't know what diabetes was. I just knew that he had it. But we had an experience one Christmas where he had a pretty severe hypoglycemic event and had a very low blood sugar that I had to help him overcome. And it was scary, but that was when you start solidifying and understanding more about what the disease is. And I started understanding more and realized, man, this could really take my uncle and someone I love away from me. And I didn't like that at all. The fight was on. And we always stayed really close, and he was with me when I graduated college, and I had always had an interest in diabetes because of my uncle and knew that that's what I wanted to work on. That's what I wanted to be my life's work. And he knew that and was always supportive of me. And through college, through medical school, he was there the day I graduated from medical school and graduate school. And he was actually the very first patient with diabetes that I examined. After I graduated from medical school, he came and just grabbed me and said, Bryce, grab your stethoscope. I want you to come back to this back room of the house that we were staying in. He said, that's what he told me. He said, I want to be the first patient that you ever examine who has diabetes. So it was an experience that I never forgot. And he was fortunate that he, about that same time when I was graduating medical school, was starting to have some of the complications of diabetes. He was having kidney failure. He was losing his eyesight, and so was really fighting. He had a kidney transplant, but unfortunately he was rejecting that kidney that was donated by his sister. And he then went to Duke and had a dual pancreas kidney transplant. So for the last year of his life, he was diabetes-free and was living a real wonderful life. But unfortunately, the years of immunosuppression, he actually developed pancreatic cancer of his endogenous, his own pancreas. And in my intern year of pediatric residency, I lost him. He died from pancreatic cancer. But, the thing that I always try to remember, while I love him and I miss my uncle more than I can say, the legacy that he left, I think, is bigger than himself. And I think he understood that. When I graduated medical school, he had told my mom that if I have to live this fight so that Bryce can someday help other people, then this fight is worth it. Those are the kind of things that stick with you. And I knew that I wasn't going to let my uncle down, and I wasn't going to let my future patients down. And so all the families that I work with now, it's all because of my Uncle Mitchell, what he did and the passion that he instilled in me. And even to this day, I hope that he's proud of me.
Bryce, it's amazing to think of what that means to you and the impact he had on you. And looking at all of the things that are coming, I don't want to get too cliche or too pat here, but you have to think about your uncle in terms of the difference he made in bringing you to medicine, the people that you help, and the advances that are being made. You must think about him all the time with that.
Oh, I do. I think about him all the time. And I think about the legacy that he started. And I guess the analogy I use is a tree. My uncle helped sow the seed in me and helped this tree take root, about helping improve the lives of children and family with diabetes. He sowed that seed. He helped that tree take root. And so every family that I get to work with, we're just adding new leaves to the tree. We're adding new life to that tree. And it's ever growing. So whether I'm in Greenville or whether I'm somewhere else, that tree is always growing. It's growing, it's thriving, and it's adding new leaves every year. And so that's how I think about my uncle and the legacy that he had, and why it's so much bigger than him, is that my love for him and my interaction with him is what's put me where I'm at and helped me be in the place that I feel like I need to be, and why taking care of families with diabetes is more than just adjusting insulin. It's about improving their lives and helping them live their lives to the fullest.
I will link up more information about Dr. Nelson and about everything we talked about. I'm not linking to the insulin manufacturer site, but I'll try to link to one or two good articles that may help you if you'd like to do an even deeper dive into the insulin issue. And we wish Dr. Nelson the very best. I've only met him once in person, talked to him a couple of times, know a lot of his patients, but man, sad to see him go, but very happy for the people in the Richmond, Virginia area who are getting a really good guy. All right, in our Tell Me Something Good this week, this is a great story of a middle schooler who saw a need, created something new, won an award, and helped out her grandpa. Tell Me Something Good is brought to you by Real Good Foods. This is the best story. The food itself, okay, Real Good Foods, before I get to the story. Low carb, high in protein, and really good people. The CEO got a letter a while back from a 9-year-old with type 1, and it was all about how happy he was to have a yummy pizza that his parents felt good about. The pizza only has 8 carbs. Now, Real Good Foods isn't a diabetes company per se, but that letter made them realize that they wanted to do more in our community. I am so excited to have them on board for the podcast this year, and I'll be telling you all about their yummy pizza, poppers, and so much more. Benny loves their food. You know, we're fine with regular pizza. We figured it out for him, but man, this is easy. It's always nice to have a lower carb option when you're not trying to do a combo bolus, you know, everything that goes along with it. Real Good Foods, they are awesome. Find out more at diabetes-connections.com and click on the Real Good Foods logo. Cool story from Ohio. An 11-year-old had watched her grandfather get very frustrated because, I mean, you know how this happens. You're trying to get every drop out of your insulin pen, but you know there's always a couple of drops left in there and you can't get them out. You know, sometimes you'll suck them out with a syringe, but then you get all the air bubbles. So 11-year-old Michaela had to create a problem-solving invention for a school competition. And she knew exactly what she wanted to do. She invented the You Get It All insulin plunger. I'm going to read from an article from the Columbus Dispatch. And it says, this is a device she designed to expel the last drops of insulin from pen cartridges. The Columbus student created it by modifying an existing glass plunger. She heated it by placing it in boiling water and then shaping it using metal tools. She is a 6th grader. She is looking now to get a patent, and she says it's not going to help just her grandfather, but she also has a classmate who gives herself insulin every day at school. So Michaela's idea won top prize at the Ohio Invention Convention in July. She won money for college. She is hoping to go to veterinary school someday. And she's now in a national contest for the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation. How cool is that? I'm going to put a link in the show notes because Michaela is raising money for her trip to go to the Henry Ford Museum competition. So I'll link that up if you're interested. Very cool news, very cool invention. I am rooting for her. Such exciting stuff. I love bringing the good news every week. If you've got something you'd like to tell me about, you don't have to win a competition or climb Mount Everest. Any kind of milestone or good news that you'd like to share with the community, drop me a line, Stacey at diabetes-connections.com, or just pop into the Facebook group, Diabetes Connections, the group, and give me the goods. Tell me something good. Okay, looking ahead on the calendar. As I said, Diabetes Podcast Week kicks off the second full week of February. You'll be hearing more about that. In terms of travel, my March is already looking very busy. I'm heading back to Syracuse University to talk podcasting to students. I did that in the fall, and I love doing it. We had a good time. For that event, I hooked up with JDRF in the Syracuse area as well. I'm not sure if we're going to do that again. Maybe we'll reach out and see. But later in the month, I will be going to the West Coast for Friends for Life out in Seattle, the big Children with Diabetes conference. Side note, Children with Diabetes redid their website. I will link that up in the show notes as well because it is so great looking. They were one of the first, if not the first, diabetes website and chat. I want to say it was like the mid-90s when Children with Diabetes went up. It's helped a lot of people over the years, even though it looked, I guess, kind of old-fashioned. I loved the website, never had any issue with it, but it looks really slick and nice now. So I will be at Friends for Life in Seattle. We're actually taking a family trip. That's my kids' spring break. We're going to go out to California and Oregon and end up in Seattle. So hopefully, if you're out that way, show up and we can meet. That'd be great. Happy to come to your conference or come speak to your group. Just drop me a line and let you know. I do a bunch of presentations, or it's always fun just to tape a live podcast episode as well. Thanks, as always, to my editor, John Buchanan, with Audio Editing Solutions. And thanks to you as you listen. I appreciate the notes, the emails, and the really good comments on Facebook. It is so rewarding to do this show every week for such a passionate and well-informed audience. It's really unique. You know, I've been in broadcasting my entire career, and I'll be honest with you, you know, I covered politics and general news and kind of surface level health for a long time. This is the most rewarding project of my professional career. It's kind of selfish in that way, how much I get out of doing it. So thank you so much for listening. Share it with a friend who is touched by diabetes. I'd really appreciate it. It's the best way to get the word out about the show. It's not advertising from me, it's word of mouth from you. And I know you're already doing that. I really appreciate it. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here next week.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.